Welcome to a brand new lecture about entomology. Today we are going to learn about the head of an insect and some theories related to head segmentation. So let's start. The insect head is a hard, highly sclerotized compact capsule bearing a group of feeding appendages around the mouth, sensory organs, and internally a major center of neuroendocrine coordination. Head segmentation. It is absolutely impossible to recognize the segmentation of a head from its morphology in the adult condition. The embryological studies may, however, help in solving the problem. According to phylogenetic considerations, the insect head is in fact a product of evolution and can be termed as a syncephalon. It consists of two parts, the anterior prosencephalon and a posterior gnathocephalon. The procephalon represents preoral region of the head and bears two paired structures, the eyes and the antennae. The procephalon is thought to be derived from the ancestral head, the archicephalon or blastocephalon, after an incorporation of at least one posterior trunk segment of the ancestor. The brain is considered as a fused ganglion of the procephalon. The gnathocephalon represents posterior region of the head. It bears three paired structures, the mandibles, first maxillae and second maxillae or labium. The gnathocephalon seems to be absolutely anthropod in structure. It is mostly developed in order to equip the head with feeding appendages. Embryological and morphological studies suggest unequivocally that the gnathocephalon is composed of three segments, the mandibular, maxillary and labial segments. In an adult insect, these segments are evident from their paired appendages. The subesophageal ganglion is undoubtedly a composite ganglion of the gnathocephalon. There is no contrary beliefs or controversy about segmentation of gnathocephalon. The segmentation of procephalon is all the while a subject of dispute. In this regard, various theories have been proposed from time to time, and the discussion on this subject due to its multifold impact is ever interesting. The classical theory. This theory is mostly based on embryonic evidence, such as presence of neuroneous, embryonic segmental appendages, and coelomic sacs. Goodrich in 1897 proposed on the basis of embryonic evidence that the procephalon is formed from the anteriormost three somites along the unsegmented apicon acron. These somites or metameres of procephalon are commonly called as the preantennal, antennal and intercalary segments respectively. The preantennal segment is characterized by containing protocerebral part of the brain, the first pair of cephalic coelomic sacs and limb primordia in some insects. In adult stage, this segment is devoid of appendages. Then the antennal segment consists of deutocerebral part of the brain, the second pair of cephalic coelomic sacs in the embryo, and a pair of antennae as the segmental appendages. The intercalary segment bears tritocerebral part of the brain, the third pair of coelomic sac in the embryo, but devoid of segmental appendages in the adult condition. It is homologous to the second antennal segment of the crustacean. Ancestor head, trunk. Then insect acron, archicerebrum, tritocerebrum, subesophageal region, procephalon, gnathocephalon, prothorax, mesothorax, metathorax, abdomen. These are the parts. Syncephalon is also there. This theory therefore holds that the insect head is composed of six segments, the procephalon and gnathocephalon each formed of three segments. The theory has been accepted by a large number of prominent entomologists, though they differ in nomenclature of the respective segments and in consideration of segmental appendages. According to Lankster in 1881 and Vialans in 1887, the eye stalks are the appendages of the first segment and to be named as the ocular segment, while Tykes in 1940, the Manton in 1960 consider that the first segment is labral, having labrum as its appendage. There is also a third group of workers and Rampel and Church, suggesting the first segment as pre-antennal, one bearing no appendages, and has been universally accepted. Two prominent insect morphologists, Snodgrass in 1950 and Duporte in 1957, consider the eyes and antennae as the structures belonging to the acron and not to any head segment. Their major argument against the classical theory is not even a single species of insect in its embryonic condition shows the presence of three distinct coelomic sacs and limb primordia, and thus the validity of the theory is incompetent, deductive, and misleading to a great extent. Then the labral segmental theory. Weismann in 1926 reported two pre-antennal segments with two paired rudimentary sacs in the embryo of the stick insect, Carotius morosus. In first of this is the labral segment with the labrum as a fused appendage, while the second one is the pre-antennal segment without appendages in the adult stages. Roonval in 1937 and Gingran in 1947 also found two pre-antennal coelomic sac in the embryos of the locusts, Locusta and Schistocerca. All these workers included that the prosencephalon is a four-segmented structure, and ultimately the head is overall composed of 7 segments: the labral, the pre-antennal and antennal, the intercalary or premandibular forming the procephalon, and the mandibular, the maxillary, and the labial segments forming the gnathocephalon. Then Roonval in 1939 suggested that the protocerebrum is composed of two pairs of neuromeres. One is the labral and the other pre-antennal, belonging to the labral and pre-antennal segments respectively. The superlingual segmental theory. Some workers, mostly working on the embryonic development of the pterygote insect, noticed a pair of appendages known as the superlinguae. The hypopharynx is supposed to be formed due to fusion of the median lingua with a pair of lateral superlinguae. These superlinguae are considered as the paired appendages. Belonging to the superlingual segment. Chaudhary in 1950 confirmed the presence of the sublingual segment in between the intercalary and mandibular segments in pterygote Thermobiobia domestica. According to him, the insect head is made up of 7 segments in all, like pre-antennal, antennal, intercalary, and superlingual segments constituting the procephalon, mandibular, maxillary, and labial segments representing the gnathocephalic part of the head. Then the Holmgren-Hanstom theory. According to Holmgren, 1996 to 1916, the Hangstrom in 1925-30, the antennae and the eyes are belonging to the acron, and these structures cannot be accounted as procephalic segmental appendages as suggested by earlier workers believing the classical theory. Their theory is principally based on the skeletomuscular and neuroanatomical systems of large number of annelids and arthropods. They believe that proto and deuterocerebral parts of the insect brain are secondarily differentiated from the annelidian brain or from the archicerebrum. In this way, they have maintained close homology between the arthropodians archicephalon and the annelidian prostomium. The procephalon of insect head is therefore formed after fusion of a single posterior segment, the intercalary segment, with the archicephalon or acron. This theory is further strongly supported by Snodgrass and Duporte, but in the option that the second antennae might have been lost in the insects and the labrum appeared to be the appendage of intercalary segment. Snodgrass considers the labrum as a preoral structure, while Dupote as a part of the first somite. According to these workers, the intercalary segment is the first true segment with the tritocerebrum as its ganglion. This theory maintains that the insect head is opposed of the acron and four segments. The intercalary segment incorporated into protocerebrum and acron. The maxillary and labial segments incorporating into the gnathocephalon. The Ferrix-Henry theory. Ferris and Henry in 1947-48 brought forward a theory of head segmentation on the basis of external morphology of the head of adult insects and annelids and the nerve innervation of cephalic region. According to Ferris and Henry theory, the head is composed of 6 segments. These segments are demarcated externally by the transverse sutures. The segments are termed as the labral, clipial, oculoantennal, mandibular, maxillary, and labial. According to him, the intercalary segment is fantastically investigated and does not bear true identity as well as any relevant evidence. The head consists of the labral segment as the anteriormost segment, and there are no preoral structures. He believes that the polychaete proboscis is represented in the insect head by the first 3 segments and is therefore metameric as opposed to the stomodial origin. The eyes and antennae are prostomial in origin. Henry in 1947-48 asserted that the ganglion as a rudimentary and innervates the same segment to which it belongs. The tritocerebrum, therefore, is ganglion of a labral segment. This theory is discarded by several workers on the plea that head sutures are merely the secondary developed unsclerotized regions of lines formed due to internal ridges. They may appear simply as the lines of weakness allowing emergence of the succeeding insta from the old exuvia during molting. The homology made by Henry in between the annelid proboscis and preoral part of insect head is also ruled out, as the nerve connection or innervation is altogether absent. Again, embryonic evidence does not support this theory. The head belongs. Then the head skeletons we are going to learn. The head of the insect loses its primary segmentation during the post-embryonic development due to enormous sclerotization. The head becomes a hard skeletal capsule. It bears externally a set of sensory and gnathal appendages. The sense organs include a pair of antennae, a pair of compound eyes, and 2 or 3 ocelli. The gnathal appendages comprises of a pair of mandibles, a pair of maxillae, and a labia. Okay, the gnathal appendage constitute collectively along the labrum and hypopharynx, a well-elaborated feeding apparatus. The position of the mouth parts in relation to the body axis differs in different groups of insects. The mouth parts may project downward, upward, backward, and the head accordingly is designed as not upward, downward, forward, or backward. And the head accordingly is designated as the hypognathous, orthopteroid insects, prognathous, some dipteran flies and larval coleoptera, then opistognathous, hemiptera, Thysanoptera, etc. Then the head sutures. The head capsule of the matured insect is differentiated into several regions by the sutures. The sutures are nothing but the secondarily developed fine grooves. Although the true nature of the morphological significance of the sutures is still incompletely understood, they are inflections or merely external impressions of the internal stiff cuticular ridges which provide mechanical support to the cranial wall. Some workers have taken into account the sutures as the intersegmental lines, but now it is well established and these structures are the product of sclerotization, and except the post-occipital suture, others have no metameric significance. The common sutures of the insect head are described below. The clipeo-labral suture. The suture represents the lower margin of the clypeus. The labrum is hanging down from the suture. It bears a prominent ridge internally. The ridge possesses an apodeme at the center. The apodeme provides an insertion to the anterior retractor muscle of the labrum. Then the clipeofrontal or epistomal suture. It occurs between the clypeus and the frons. It bears laterally the anterior tentorial pits. It internally bears a strong inflection. This inflection strengthens the lower part of the head against the stretching of the mandibles. Then the epicranial suture. It is a composite suture. It appears in the form of an inverted Y above the facial region in most of the insects. The stem is known as the coronal and the lateral arms the frontal suture. The epicranial suture is partially or even completely reduced in some insects. It is totally lacking from the head of apterygotes. Snodgrass in 1935 and Duporte in 1957 stated that the epicranial suture represent merely the line of weakness and can be said in true sense are the echidicial suture. It does not bear the skeletal ridge on the inner surface and therefore does not provide either a site for muscle attachment or mechanical support to the head capsule. Then the occipital suture. It is the horseshoe or U-shaped suture and well evident on the posterior part of the head of the orthopteroid insects. It starts from posterior articulations of the mandibles of either side. Both the arms, after running a long distance, join one another above the radial foramen. It separates the genal area from the postgenal area of the lateral region of the head. It also differentiates the vertex from the occiput in posterior region of the head. It forms an internal ridge strengthening the posterior epicranial wall. The post-occipital suture. It embraces the occipital foramen magnum from the dorsal and lateral sides. Each end of the suture merges in the hypostomal suture in ventral region. This site is well defined due to the presence of the posterior tentorial pits. It possesses internally a strong epidemal ridge, the post-occipital ridge. It provides a site for the attachment of prothoracic muscles which move a pair of ventrolateral condyles. The neck membrane is firmly attached to this ridge. The condyles articulate with the neck sclerites. It is the only suture having the metameric significance. It alone marks the fusion of the maxillary and labial segments of the head. The frontogenal or subocular suture. It develops on each lateral region of the head. It starts from the junction of the clipeofrontal and subgenal sutures. It terminates in the close vicinity of the lower margin of each compound eye. It is virtually well evident in the orthopteroid insects. Then the subgenal suture. These sutures occur on the lateral sides of the head. Each suture joins the posterior tentorial pit with the anterior tentorial pit of the same side. Each suture is divisible into two parts. One part of the subgenal suture is called the hypostomal suture. The hypostomal suture runs from the posterior tentorial pit up to the posterior articulation of the mandible. The other part of the subgenal suture is called the pleurostomal suture. The pleurostomal suture arches over the mandible and finally joins with the frontoclypeal and the frontogenal sutures just above the anterior articulation of the mandibles. Internally, the subgenal sutures form the subgenal ridges. Each ridge extends from the posterior tentorial pit to a point just above the anterior articulation of the mandible. The subgenal sutures strengthen the cranial wall along the lines of attachment of the gnathal appendages. Then the ocular sutures. These sutures are the annular grooves around the compound eye. They form the skeletal ridge internally. Then the antennal suture. The marginal depressed ring along the antennal sockets are known as the antennal sutures. Each suture gives internally the submarginal ridge. The submarginal ridge in a large number of insects bears a pivot-like process known as an antennifer. The antennifer provide articulation to the antenna. Head sclerites or areas. The cuticular areas can be seen on the external surface of the head. They become well evident after dechitinization when treated with aqueous KOH at high temperature. These areas of the head capsule are also known as the head sclerites. The sclerites represent simply the intersutural areas. The head of the generalized insect is typically exhibiting the following sclerites. The labrum. It is a widely discussed structure of the head. Some workers have regarded it as a fused segmental appendage, which is now universally accepted as a sclerite of the head. It is freely attached to the lower margin of the clypeus by the clypeolabral suture, generally hanging over the mouth or the preoral cavity, and also termed as an upper lip, particularly in the mandibulate insect. In the feeding insects, it undergoes various modifications. Internally, it forms the anterior part of the epipharyngeal wall of the preoral cavity. It is internally lined with the gustatory receptors and can be moved upwards, downwards, and be pulled and pushed to some extent due to the elastic nature of the suture and muscle intervention. The labrum is innervated by following three types of muscles. The compressor labra. They may occur in a pair of lateral sides or single median one. They are attached by one end on the anterior end and by the other end on the posterior wall of the labrum. The compressors bring the retraction, prolongation and contraction of the labrum. Anterior muscle, posterior muscle, labral compressor muscle, labrum. The anterior labral. They are the paired but unbranched labral muscles. They originate from the inner surface of the frons. They move the labrum in forward direction. The posterior labral. They are the paired but branched labral muscles. They originate from the anterior lateral regions of the frons. The muscles pull the labrum backward. The clypeus. The sclerite is demarcated by the clypeolabral and clypeofrontal sutures from the anterior and posterior sides. It thus occupies the posterior in between the anterior labral and posterior frontal sclerites. In some insects, it is completely or partially divided into two parts by a transverse suture. The posterior part is termed as a postclypeus and the anterior part is termed as anticlypeus. Both parts of the clypeus can be seen in the cases of crickets. The postclypeus modifies into a convex process termed as the gingivimus of the mandible, which is this is the sclerite of the head on which arise the cibarial dilator muscle. Then the frons. It extends from the anterior clypeofrontal suture to the posterior frontal suture. On the orthopteroid insects, it possesses the median ocellus. In some cases, it may bear the lateral ocelli also. Whenever the clypeofrontal suture remains ill-defined, the anterior temporal pits reveal the demarcation of this sclerite from the clypeal region, like cockroaches. The frons represent typically an upper facial region of the head. The pharyngeal dilators, labral, hypopharyngeal muscles and the adductors of mandibles are usually inserted on the middle of the frons. The epiranium. The epiranial suture separate the epiranium from the frons. It represents the entire upper region on top of the head. It extends from the anterior frontal to the posterior occipital suture. Above the frons, it is divided by the coronal suture into two identical lateral plates known as the parietals. The parietals are characterized by bearing the antennae, lateral ocelli and the compound eyes. The anterior undivided region of the epicardium is known as the vertex. It forms top of the head. The independent status of the vertex as a sclerite is still controversial. The occiput. It is the U-shaped posterior or hinder cuticular band. It represents the area from the occipital to the post-occipital suture. In the higher insects, however, the occipital suture is obscure. The post-occiput. The occipital foramen is encircled from the dorsal and lateral regions by a narrow sclerite, the post-occiput. It lies between the occiput and the neck. The post-occiput is marked off from the occiput by a transverse post-occipital suture. When the post-occipital suture remains absent, the posterior tentorial pits separate from the post-occiput from the occiput. The dorsal thoracic muscles are attached to the endoskeleton ridge of the post-occipital suture. These muscles articulate the head freely. The anterolateral inner margin of the post-occiput produces small processes. These structures are termed as the occipital condyles. Each condyle articulates with the anterior lateral cervical sclerite. Then the genae and the subgenal areas. The genae represent the lateral areas of the head. On either side, the genae extend from the compound eye to the mandibular trochate. The hinder part develops into the socket to accommodate the mandibular condyle. Posterior to the occipital suture, each lateral gena is commonly called as the postgena. Each postgena provides the condylar articulation for the maxillae. The subgenal area above and below the mandibles can be referred to as the pleurostoma and hypostoma respectively. These areas are separated in some insects by the suture, the hypostomal suture. Similarly, the pleurostomal suture represent the pleurostoma from the base of mandibles. The ocular sclerites, they form a cuticular ring around each compound eye. The antennal sclerites, they form an annulus at the base of each antenna. The antennal sclerites are well developed in the Plecoptera. Then the mandibular trochante, it occurs quite distinctively between the mandibular base and the pleurostoma or the pleurostomal suture. The sclerites and their bearing on the head segmentation, according to Poole in 1944 and Ferris in 1947 and Matsuda in 1956. The sclerites represent the segments and the sutures, the intersegmental lines. It is, however, true for the post-occipital suture as it acts as an intersegmental line in between the maxillary and the labial segments, but the same generalization cannot be made for other sutures. Ferris in 1943 tried to convince that the fons represents the facial area of the antennal segment. The status of segment to the fons has been discarded as Snodgrass in 1947 on the basis of the fact that the antennae are all the while located on the parietals and never on the fronts. Most of the areas of the head are termed by different names only for convenience to follow the topography of the insect head without taking into account their metameric or functional significance. These sutures simply represent the topographical areas of the head that are differentiated through the process of sclerotization. Goodrich in 1897 and Haymonis in 1901 emphasized the acronal nature of the labrum, while eyes belong to the first metameric segment, the ocular segment. Eastham in 1930 was considering the labrum as an appendage of the first segment, the labral or pre-antennal segment. Tiggs in 1940 extended his support in favor of these workers with the notion that labrum also includes the acron and the front region. Then Chodoneret in 1950 suggested that the labrum is representing the appendage of the intercalary segment rather than the first segment, as it is innervated by the nerve arising from the trichocerebrum, the intercalary or second antennal ganglia. Ducorte in 1960 advocated strongly that the labrum is an apical lobe of the acron or annelid posterior. A similar view was also expressed by Snodgrass in 1960 that the labrum represents the embryonic procephalic lobe in the adult condition of the insect without bearing status of either a segment or an appendage. It is simply a sclerite lying over the mouth. Next, we will be learning about the tentorium and modification of head capsule in next session. Then we will be learning about cephalic appendages, antennae, etc. in detail. Next session we will be learning about the mouth parts of insects.